Welcome to London Futurists, where we look at the most important scenarios for the 2020s and beyond. And many of these scenarios have to do with automation, increasing power of software and hardware to do things which previously we thought required uniquely human skills. So what are the two possibilities with automation? What are the threats? What are the opportunities? And to discuss this, I'm very pleased to be joined all the way from Ireland by John Danaher. So John, for those who don't know you very well, perhaps you could get the ball going by saying a few things about yourself and the kinds of work you like to do.
Yeah, so I am presently employed as a senior lecturer in law in the National University of Ireland in Galway. But I don't think I would define myself as a lawyer. I think I'm tangentially connected to the law. That's my background and my training. But I'm primarily a philosopher of technology. I work a lot on the ethical, social, and legal implications of new and emerging technologies. I probably started my career focusing a lot on debates around human enhancement and transhumanism, and I've migrated in recent years into adjacent fields around AI and robotics. I write a blog called Philosophical Disquisitions, where I have lots of articles about ethics and technology, and I've also written in the past for the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies as well.
So John, what led you to write your book, Automation and Utopia? What were your goals there?
One goal was to address what I thought was a kind of a gap in the market. This is, I guess, the standard rationale for anyone to write a book on automation. So as you are aware, and I'm sure most of the people watching this are aware, a lot of things have been written in the past decade or so about automation and the future of work. You have books like Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee's The Second Machine Age, or Martin Ford's The Rise of the Robots. And they do, I think, a decent job setting out a case for the possibility of widespread technological unemployment and the idea that we as a society have to do something to respond to that. Those have also been backed up by more academic kind of reports and articles that try and quantify the amount of labor or the number of tasks in the workforce that can be automated. There's obviously been a bit of a backlash to that as well since, where people are maybe a little bit more skeptical of the notion of widespread technological unemployment. So what I wanted to do, though, was to do something different from those books, because where I think a lot of those books fall down is when they try to imagine what comes after technological unemployment. What kind of future are we heading into? In particular, you get some futurist literature that is quite enthusiastic about the notion of a post-work future, that this is something that we should embrace. And I don't think most of the work that's been done so far does a good job on evaluating in a rigorous way whether that really would be a good thing. And so that's the kind of book that I wanted to write, was to write something that seriously engaged with the arguments for and against a post-work future and tried to see whether there was a utopian possibility embedded in this notion of a post-work future.
Are you able to share some of the conclusions? What do you think about the possibilities for a post-work future? Are you on the camp that are enthused? Are you on the camp that are skeptical? Or do you see multiple possibilities ahead?
Well, I'm by nature an academic and I hedge everything. But in the book, I tried to come down in favor of certain views. Maybe not 100% endorsing them, but saying that there's good things about the post-work future that we should embrace. So, what I've done in the book is I've kind of neatly divided it into a defense of 4 propositions, because this is the style of argument and analysis that I engage in. So the first proposition is that I think that the automation of work is possible and desirable. And part of that is just kind of bolstering the case for technological employment, but the other part of it is arguing that this would be a good thing, that work is, in many cases, a bad thing for many people, and that we should do what we can to hasten the automation of work. The second proposition is that despite my enthusiasm for the automation of work, I think that there are a number of risks and threats posed by widespread automation. So the way in which I phrase it in the book is that I think the automation of life more generally outside of work can be a bad thing, that it poses a threat to human flourishing and meaning in particular. Then the fourth proposition in the book is that one of the ways in which we could mitigate against those threats of automation is try to become more like the machines that are replacing us. And this is what I refer to as building a cyborg utopia. And I think that there's a number of beneficial aspects to that, but I worry about its practicality and feasibility, certainly in the short to medium term. And I also think it has a number of risks attached to it that make it kind of less appealing than it first appears. And then the final proposition in the book is the idea that instead of becoming like the machines that are replacing us, we should sort of retreat from the real world and leave the machines to do what they're good at while we live in a virtual world. And what I argue is that there's actually a lot of potential in that idea, and it's something that we should take it seriously and possibly even endorse as being the best version of a post-work future would be a virtual utopia.
Wow, so much to go into there. What kind of timescales are you having in mind here? This possible increase of technological unemployment and automation more generally. Is this something that we look forward to at the end of the 21st century, or sooner than that, or later than that?
I mean, I think that the displacement of workers is going to happen in sort of the next 10 to 50 years, let's say. I mean, up to 2050. I think we're going to see significant disruption of the kinds of work that we currently see in the economy. I mean, if you take seriously some of these reports that have come out about technological unemployment, such as the infamous Oxford Martin School report about 47% of work being computerizable, to use their language, or the McKinsey report, which talks about 50% of tasks in the global workforce being automatable in the next 10 to 20 years. And those reports came out a number of years ago. We're looking at a significant amount of work that is currently being done in the economy being automated probably by 2030 or not too far beyond that. Now, like whether that means that we're going to have widespread technological unemployment is a different question. And that's something I tried to get into a bit in the book, because it doesn't necessarily mean that, because economists will argue that sure, we'll displace some kinds of work and some tasks, but we're going to find other jobs for people. There's other opportunities out there. There's tasks that complement the kinds of labor that machines perform, and we can just train humans to perform those tasks. I'm skeptical about that in the long run. I think, it's pretty difficult to reorganize our educational and training institutes so that we train people into skills that are complementary to machines. I also think there are risks here about the timelines involved. How fast can you train humans versus how fast can you improve machine labor? And I also think the kind of economy that we've created nowadays is one in which much less work needs to be done to exploit even the new opportunities that might be created in this economy. So, I think we're looking at fairly significant displacement of workers within the next between 10 and 50 years, I would say. I mean, just one other point of caution here, I would say, is that when I talk about technological employment, I don't necessarily imagine a world in which nobody works. I think there will always be some percentage of the population that works. The question really is, like, what percentage is that? In most industrial economies at the moment, you have a labor force participation rate of somewhere between 60 and 70%, which indicates that between 30 and 40% of adults are not working and not even looking for work. So my view is if that figure goes down to, let's say, 30%, then we're really talking about a post-work economy where the majority of adults do not work for a living. And that's a very different world from the one in which we currently live, I think.
So you said that if we try to retrain people to do new kinds of tasks, that'll be very hard. We'll have to adjust how the education system works, amongst other things. But is that going to be harder, more challenging than the other scenario you've just said, which is that we're going to have to find ways to cope in a society in which only maybe 30% or fewer people are working and the rest of us won't have any salary? Which of these two is less difficult to achieve?
Yeah, so I mean, the way in which I frame it in the book is that I think that most of these things are difficult. So like collectively restructuring society so that we repurpose our educational system so that people are trained into skills that are complementary to machines, that'll be challenging. Restructuring our civilization so that we embrace the notion of a post-work future is also going to be challenging. So it's a question of like, pick your challenges and which one do you think is more valuable and more worthwhile in the long run. And so what I would worry about in the first option, which you can view as like the more conservative option of just trying to maintain employability through retraining, is that it'll just kind of perpetuate an arms race or a competition against the machines, and that it won't be very pleasant for individuals in the long run. There'll be more anxiety and precariousness associated with the forms of work that they're engaging in, which is a phenomenon that we already see in the labor market. So I think if we're going to pick our battles, I think we're better off picking the other battle. And what I tried to do in the book is to outline the reasons for thinking that that is the battle that we should pick.
You talked about a race against the machines. Martin Ford's book is called The Rise of the Robots. As you suggested, many people react against that and say, well, we don't need to race against the machines. We can become a machine like ourselves. We can merge with robots and become like cyborgs. And so there's no need to worry, because anything that the robots could do, we'll be able to do as well. So can you give us your brief assessment of this cyborg utopia possibility?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of potential embedded in the idea of the cyborg utopia, and I tried to give a very kind of detailed and fair hearing to it in the book. I think it's actually the longest chapter in the book. It might be like 60, 70 pages long, but I dedicate to discussing the cyborg utopia. So, I mean, I think the advantages of it are that, well, maybe it can stave off this threat of replacement by machines, but also there's other like intrinsic reasons for favoring it, which you'll be familiar with, and people watching this will be familiar with. It's just that, you know, it allows us to explore the horizons of what is possible for human beings, you know, embrace new forms of living, new kind of morphological forms, new intellectual or cognitive forms of living. It also holds out the potential of, you know, extending capacities, enhancing capacities, and extending lifespan. And another thing that I talk about a good bit in the book is the notion of going off planet, exploring space. This was the original rationale for the cyborg. That, you know, the term was coined by a couple of authors who were writing about the human future in space, about how we could explore space, and saying that biological tissue is too fragile for the interstellar environment or solar system, so we need to become cyborg-like. So I think there's a lot of potential embedded in it. I have some worries about it in the book, and I suppose like I'll just mention two of them for now. One is that I think the timelines involved here are questionable. So, you know, is it the case that we're going to improve cyborg technology at a pace that, you know, keeps up with developments in autonomous AI and autonomous robotics? And I'm not sure that we will. And it seems that, you know, it's much trickier and riskier to integrate machine parts with biological parts. We have some, you know, very tantalizing developments in this field at the moment, but nothing, I would say, really dramatic or significant. I could be wrong. There could be developments within that space in the next few years that prove me wrong, but I think there are significant engineering challenges that means that it's not likely to happen at a pace that is fast enough to correct the problems that we see with automation, or that are coming from automation. The other problem with that as well, which is kind of embedded in the first part of the book, is that if we follow the cyborg path, we're more than likely going to perpetuate the existing economic framework. You know, at the moment, what workers do is that they compete for education and credentials in order to make themselves employable on the job market. And in the future, what's going to happen is they're just going to compete in cyborg enhancements as well. And I think that this could kind of double down on many of the worst features of the job market in the present day. And so that we won't be able to realize then a truly post-work future by following the cyborg utopia. So that those are the two main arguments that I offer in that chapter.
On the merger scenario, I'm reminded of a picture that was shown by Jan Tallinn, the founding engineer of Skype and Kazaa. He has a picture of a very fast, very large train bearing down on a platform at near supersonic speed. And the question comes to the human on the platform, who here wants to merge? If it's really going at its full speed, and we've still got the limits of our human anatomy, our human architecture, which have served us wonderfully, but they are limited. It is difficult to see how quickly we could improve compared to the possible, well, let's use the word exponential improvements in AI.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very visceral metaphor for, you know, describing the dilemma. And as you put it, like the human hardware, the biology hasn't changed much in the past 40,000 years or so. There's lots of interesting developments and there's lots of speculation about what could be possible through human enhancement, but we really haven't seen any significant breakthroughs in that space yet. So that's the concern there, I think.
So if we're being wise, we should at least have a plan for the scenario in which we're not going to be able to keep up with AIs and automation. We will enhance, but we won't enhance to the same extent. So what is your plan there? You've said there might be a crisis of a sense of meaning. If we have nothing to do, then it makes us better than automation and robots. So how will humans find a purpose and a value?
Yeah, so this is the big challenge that I tried to address. And part of this will come from what do we understand by human flourishing and human meaning. And I have a long enough discussion of that in the book, relying on some of these classical philosophical theories of well-being and flourishing. So, very briefly, to live a good life, the general consensus in philosophical circles is that you need to be subjectively satisfied and engaged with the kind of life that you're living. You could frame that in terms of happiness as well, but I don't necessarily want to use the word happiness because it has certain connotations that might be misleading. So I prefer the idea of subjective satisfaction from the life that you're living. And then also that you need to be doing something that is, in some sense, valuable. That it's not just valuable to you, but it has some broader objective significance. And so, the big challenge, I think, with automation outside of work is that it threatens to break the link between our subjective world and what we can do in the objective world. So, because essentially with automation, you're outsourcing something to a machine. You're getting a machine to do something on your behalf. That means that if a machine does something, it's no longer yours. So, just to give an illustration of this, when the IBM or DeepMind designed these systems that could perform better at games than humans, were the achievements of the machine in being better than humans, were they the achievements of the designers of the machines? My argument, particularly in the case of DeepMind, is that they really aren't. Even the engineers themselves would say that software did things that they didn't anticipate or predict or they didn't design into it. Right? And there's actually a good essay about this by Carissa Velez from Oxford, where she talks about it being kind of tragic when AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol in Go. This wasn't a wonderful breakthrough for humanity. There was something kind of sad about it, that suddenly this is another domain of activity in which humans are no longer the ascendant species. And so I think that widespread automation kind of threatens to play out that dynamic across a broad range of activities. And so, the solution to this problem, I think, is to try and radically reconceive what it means to live a flourishing life to at least some extent. And very, very briefly in the book, what I argue for is this virtual utopia, which is modeled on a book written by a philosopher back in the 70s, called Bernard Suits, where he talks about the utopia of games. And so the idea is that the highest ideal for human civilization is to build a world in which everything we do is a game. And we can derive great meaning and satisfaction from games because they provide kind of intellectual and physical challenges. You can have real achievements within game worlds. You can build real alliances and friendships with people. The thing about games, though, is that they have no, let's say, kind of cosmic significance to them, right? If when you're playing a game, you're enjoying the game, you're having achievements within the game world, but you're not doing something that is of broader objective value.
But there's a value we make for ourselves, and value that
Yes.
can give us huge pleasure. And I used to play chess a bit, and occasionally when you get really absorbed in a fascinating struggle and you come out on top, it's an incredible feeling.
Yeah, so effectively the world I'm trying to imagine in the last chapter of the book is that writ large, in a sense. Okay, and I think for many people it's a counterintuitive notion, and they don't like it unless they are themselves kind of avid game players and they can see value in that world. Because a lot of times when people want their actions to have some broader significance, they want to make a great breakthrough in scientific discovery, or they want to improve the welfare of all humanity. And what I'm suggesting in the book is that those kinds of objective goods will have to leave largely to the machines in the future, and we'll have to retreat to this game-like world. But I tried to make a strong case for thinking that this is not as tragic as it appears, that there's actually a great sense of purpose and value and meaning, as you just mentioned with your example of chess, to be derived in this world. And like what I will say is one reason for embracing this world is that the old world in which meaning was always attached to, making some breakthrough in scientific discovery or doing some good for humanity, that kind of world was always a world of what I would call as elitist meaning, in that only a few people could really make the difference to those kinds of objective goods. It wasn't something that was available to the masses. Whereas the utopia of games that I discuss in the book is something that is available to the masses.
Is games the only word you've got to describe that? Is there anything else you could say to help people understand or appreciate what you've got in mind?
Well, I describe it as a virtual utopia. So, part of this is that you're building kind of fictional worlds, in a sense, or artificial worlds for you to live in. So some people mightn't necessarily describe those as games. The definition of games in the book is slightly obscure and mightn't be familiar to most people. So I just define a game as any kind of success over voluntarily imposed obstacles. So it means that you set yourself some target, some goal, and you put obstacles in your path to achieving that goal, and you voluntarily accept those obstacles. But the obstacles are arbitrary; they're not necessary to achieve the goal. So that'll sound obscure, but if you take a sport like, I don't know, golf or something, the objective of golf is to put a ball in a hole. The most efficient way to do that would probably be just pick up the ball, walk down the fairway and put it in the hole. But we don't play golf like that. Instead, we put all these obstacles in our pathway to achieving that goal. We stipulate that you can't just pick the ball up. You have to hit it with a stick, and you have to hit it in certain directions, and there are hazards, and there are all sorts of rules that prevent you from doing things that you might like. But that's what makes the game interesting and engaging. And you can kind of do that, you can multiply that dynamic of imposing arbitrary obstacles to goal achievement in many domains, and this can be a way of kind of building different artificial worlds. There's another part of this as well, so I don't just focus on games in that discussion. There's other things that you can do that make your life meaningful beyond games. You can have relationships with people, you can have families, you can engage in the traditional pleasures of drink and food and sex, that kind of thing. So all these things are still available to you. There's also a political dimension to this, which is that we can build kind of virtual communities around certain ideals that we prefer or that we're interested in.
Well, let's talk a bit about the politics, or rather the politics in the real world first, before we get to creating politics in virtual worlds, which I agree can be fascinating. People do seem to enjoy playing these strategy games when they recreate history or alternative histories. But what about the real world? There is the risk, isn't there, that as automation generates ever larger profits to a smaller number of very powerful corporations, it's not just that we're going to have an abundance of things, but there's going to be a spread of accessibility to the fruits of this abundance. You've said that we're going to have to change some aspects of the economic system in which we're working. I mean, what is your vision for that, and how credible is it that we can move to a world in which people have enough to get by on and thrive without having to work?
Yeah, so you mentioned kind of the key concepts that frame this debate. I think those terms were originally set out in the Brynjolfsson and McAfee book, where they talk about abundance versus spread. By spread, they just mean inequality. But yeah, look, if we continue down the path that we're currently going on, what we will have, I think, is a world of relative technologically mediated abundance, in the sense that many people will have access to digital goods and services, and they will benefit from them. The people will have access to AI doctors and AI lawyers and things like that. That'll be relatively widely dispersed. It may not be universally dispersed, but it'll be relatively widely dispersed. In the same way that entertainment systems are now widely dispersed to anyone in the world. As a result of this, a handful of people will profit excessively from building the platforms that distribute these digital goods to people. And we're seeing this nowadays as well. So look, we undeniably have to do something, I think, to address the imbalance, because it's not going to be economically feasible to maintain the kind of current system of just, consumerism or paying for goods and services unless we do something to change the distribution of income. It's also just not going to be politically feasible, I think, because there's going to be deep resentment against elites and against the super wealthy. Right. Now, I'm not, and the one thing I'm very keen to emphasize in work that I do is I'm not a determinist or fatalist, let's say, when it comes to technology and how it develops. I don't think that if we continue down the path that we're currently going on, we'll eventually reach some kind of crisis point where everyone will realize that we can't continue, and so we're going to implement something like a universal basic income, because that's the only way of propping up the system or maintaining it and conserving it. I think that all of these things have to be argued for and agitated for, and we need some kind of political or collective action around that. We need to get concerns about automation on the political agenda. That's one reason why I'm relatively enthusiastic about the Andrew Yang campaign in the US. He's not going to win the election, or the primary. I would be very surprised if he did, but I think he is at least starting to get this issue of automation and inequality on the political radar in the US. And I think that's a positive development, and I think we need more people like that. I realize that I've kind of skirted around the question of what's the solution to the inequality problem. I mean, basically, but my solution is that there has to be some kind of redistributivist policy. But I'm a little bit agnostic as to the exact form that it takes, although basic income guarantee is certainly the most popular and widely discussed of those solutions at the moment. And I've written things in the past where I say I'm broadly speaking in favor of it.
Well, perhaps these are topics which, amongst others, we can pick up when you visit London Futurists on, I think it's the 11th of January.
Yes, looking forward to it.
Explore things further. What are the other kind of takeaways or follow-ups that are in your mind now? It's a few months, I guess, since your book was released. You'll have seen reviews, you'll have had feedback. What do you think are the next steps that readers should take, and what are the next steps that you're thinking for yourself in terms of follow-up or possible new direction in your research?
Yeah, look, I think from readers' perspectives, at least for me, I'd be very interested in feedback and criticism. One of the objectives in writing the book was to write something that people could easily disagree with if they wanted to disagree with it, in the sense that I tried to be very clear about the arguments that I'm making, the premises or assumptions that I'm relying upon, and if people want to challenge any part of that, hopefully they can do so, and I'm more than happy to hear that feedback. I've gotten some pushback against the claims in the book so far, not as much as I would have liked. It'll probably take a few months or years. Even academia moves slowly for some of these things as well, if I'm going to get academic responses to it. A lot of people dislike the use of the word utopia in the title, which I found interesting, and that particularly in North America, that has a very kind of negative set of connotations. Anyone who's a utopianist is viewed as kind of naive and out of this world, whereas I was trying to argue, I think, for a very realistic form of utopianism, and that was one of the goals of the book, but that was interesting. I think I do have more work to do myself on clarifying and defining what this virtual utopia would consist of and how we could get from our current reality to there. What I try to do in the book is to present a very high level, abstract vision of that future that I think is defensible, but I didn't really map out exactly the pathway for getting from here to there. And so I'm doing some work on that at the moment. I'm writing a few papers on that.
I'm reminded, talking about the word utopia, I'm reminded of the book by the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, Utopia for Realists, which I think makes a strong case that actually we do need credible, plausible utopias to inspire us to make forward social progress. If we don't have a credible vision of a significantly better future, then we'll be focused instead on naive ideas from the past, or just withdraw from the political engagement altogether, which isn't healthy. So I'm very much in favor of finding credible visions of a significantly better future. The transhumanists have often been afraid of the word utopia, suggesting a fixed, static state, and they have suggested, as you know, the word extropia instead, or extropy, which just refers to ongoing progress, rather than well, we've arrived and there's nothing more to do.
Mm. Essentially, the argument for utopia that I sketch in the book is against a static or blueprint model of utopianism in favor of a dynamic, horizontal model of utopianism. That's what I argue for in the book. But you're right. Look, I think we do need credible visions for this, and I'm trying to reclaim a respectable place for utopian thinking in this world. I think what's happened in the US in particular is that utopianism has been conflated with kind of communism in many people's eyes. That the communist movement was viewed as a failed utopian movement. So I'm trying to break that link. I think Rutger Bregman has done some good work on breaking through with this, and he's obviously become very popular in the past year or so due to his remarks at the World Economic Forum last year. So
in Davos.
Hopefully this is changing. Yeah.
Well, hopefully you'll get invited to Davos soon, maybe London Futurists and a few other similar locations to start off with. I really do think that the world needs to consider these ideas seriously. We have to thank Andrew Yang, as you mentioned, for his advocacy of some similar ideas with his, I think he calls it the freedom dividend.
Yeah, it's a good rebranding, in fairness. It's not a bad name for it.
And although I agree with you, he's unlikely to become the Democratic candidate in the election in 2020, he may well be part of any cabinet that in due course is formed by whoever does become the next president, if it is a Democrat.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what was important as well is that he got them to, well, I don't know if he got them, but they debated the issue of automation at one of the recent Democratic debates. So it's also just a question of getting this issue on the political agenda. Yeah. Instead of focusing on immigrants and globalization as the cause of all the ills, it's focusing on this as being a serious concern.
Well, just yesterday I happened to watch the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who I know is a divisive figure in many camps. He was talking briefly about the political issue of the moment, Brexit, but he said the biggest tragedy of all this is it's stopping politicians from discussing the bigger question of how do we respond to the ongoing technological revolution. His view is, and I share it, that the ongoing technological revolution could significantly improve how we do healthcare, how we do education. He even talked about improving policing in a way that would cut down some of the horrific incidences of crime. And so it's up to you and me and many others to try and advocate for bringing this discussion of automation and other technological enhancements into the forefront of the public debate.
I agree. I mean, the only thing I will add is that Boris Johnson did give that speech to the UN about the mattress monitoring your dreams. So he has some vague awareness of the technological future as well.
So that's to be celebrated, I guess. Maybe we'll leave it on that positive point. So once again, I invite people who are in or near London on the 11th of January to come and hear a longer version of a discussion of these ideas, and a chance also to talk face-to-face with John and to meet many of the other very interesting people in the London Futurist community. So, John Danaher.
Looking forward to this, yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.